screams pierced the humid Florida air as glass shattered across the pavement like 1,000 tiny daggers, the sound of breaking tempered glass drowned only by the roar of a police siren that seemed to come from every direction at once, a squad car skidding sideways across the intersection as bystanders dove for cover. And in the middle of it all, a terrified black driver clutched the steering wheel with trembling hands while a white officer, face red with rage, muscles bulging beneath his vest, yelled for the driver to open the damn door now, then smashed the side window with the butt of his flashlight in a single brutal swing, sending shards raining down on the man's face as he shielded himself in panic and confusion, the body cam on the officer's chest capturing every second in vivid high definition, including the moment the officer reached through the shattered glass and punched the man square in the jaw, hard enough to snap his head back into the headrest with a thud, hard enough that people nearby gasped audibly, some pulling out their phones while others ran, unsure if more violence was coming, and all the while the man screamed, "Why are you doing this? I didn't do anything." But the officer didn't pause, didn't blink, didn't explain, just dragged the driver out onto the hot asphalt by the collar of his shirt like a sack of trash, and pinned him down with a knee to the back as backup officers rushed in yelling conflicting commands, one screaming, "Hands out!" another yelling, "Stop resisting!" though the man's hands were already flat against the pavement and slick with blood from the glass, and it was in this moment, when a mother nearby sobbed and a child asked, "Is he gonna die?" that the body cam recording would later become one of the most controversial and shocking pieces of evidence in Florida's history, exposing not just brutality but a chain of corruption that went all the way to the chief's office, a system where cover-ups were routine and good cops were silenced. And as the footage continued to roll, what it revealed would not only ignite protests across the state but spark a national reckoning. Because this wasn't just about one officer losing control. This was about a town where power had poisoned justice for far too long, and what started as a traffic stop for a supposed rolling stop at a blinking red light became the flashpoint for one of the biggest police scandals in decades. But before the world saw the footage, before the headlines screamed with outrage and civil rights lawyers took over the story, before the governor issued a midnight statement calling the incident deeply troubling, there was just that man, Jameson Wright, lying face down on the road, dazed, bleeding, and completely unaware that his body would become a symbol, his voice would be heard by millions, and his story would change the fate of an entire police department, because Jameson wasn't a criminal, wasn't violent, wasn't even speeding. In fact, he was on his way home from dropping off his daughter at choir rehearsal when the sirens lit up behind him, and he'd pulled over immediately. Hands visible on the steering wheel, windows rolled down, license and registration already in hand, and yet none of that mattered when Officer Kyle Brenner stepped out of his cruiser, fury etched into every inch of his expression like he'd been waiting all day for a reason to explode, and in his version of the story, Jameson was reaching under the seat, not complying, acting erratic, phrases that would later be repeated in every report, every press release, every internal memo designed to justify the unjustifiable, until someone, an anonymous source inside the department, leaked the unedited body cam footage to a local journalist named Elena Torres, who had already been digging into excessive force complaints in the same precinct, and when she clicked play on the raw video in her small downtown newsroom, she dropped her coffee, her hands shaking as she watched the truth unfold frame by frame. There was no weapon, no sudden movement, no threat, just a man trying to get home, brutalized without cause, and then arrested on false charges of assaulting an officer, resisting arrest and obstruction, all of which would have quietly gone through the system like hundreds of others if that footage hadn't surfaced, if Elena hadn't risked her career to go public, if Jameson hadn't survived the concussion and trauma and humiliation to speak up and demand justice. And as the video spread like wildfire across social media, the mayor held an emergency press conference. Protesters began organizing in parks and on street corners, and civil rights attorney Malik Jefferson flew in from Atlanta to represent Jameson pro bono, calling the incident an American nightmare on full display. And still, Officer Brenner remained on active duty. Until 3 days later, when a second leak revealed something even more explosive. A confidential email chain between the officer, his sergeant, and the chief of police discussing ways to control the narrative and get ahead of this before it blows up. showing deliberate intent to lie, to destroy evidence, to suppress the truth. And by the time a third video emerged, this one from a bystander's cell phone showing the same officer harassing another black man a week earlier, the town of Rosefield, Florida, became the epicenter of a media storm that no one could contain, not the mayor, not the city council, not even the governor's hastily assembled special commission on policing. Because the damage was done, the truth was out, and millions had seen it, shared it, and demanded that something, anything be done. And as for Jameson, he went from anonymous father of two to reluctant activist, speaking on national news, testifying before Congress, and reliving the worst night of his life over and over for audiences hungry for justice. But behind the scenes, as more whistleblowers came forward, as more victims spoke out, and as Internal Affairs launched its most aggressive investigation in a decade, what everyone wanted to know wasn't just what happened that night, but why it happened, how Officer Brenner was still on the street despite multiple prior complaints, how evidence had disappeared from lockup, how witnesses had been pressured into silence, and how a single act of violence had opened the door to uncovering years of misconduct, falsified reports, and systemic abuse. And the answer, as the investigation would reveal, began years earlier in the training academy, where a culture of us versus them had taken root, where young recruits were taught to see fear in every citizen and dominance as the only path to respect. And in the center of that culture stood Brenner, a rising star with a spotless file and a hidden temper, protected by a brotherhood of silence that rewarded loyalty over integrity and punished anyone who dared to speak out, like Officer Leticia Ramos, who had filed a complaint against Brenner 2 years earlier after witnessing him slam a teenage boy into a patrol car, only to be transferred to a desk job and labeled difficult, and like Sergeant Malik Daniels, who tried to flag unusual patterns in use of force reports only to be written up for insubordination. And so the question became not just whether Brenner would face charges, but whether the entire department would be dismantled, reformed, or replaced, because what the Bodycam revealed shocked everyone, but what the investigation uncovered afterward made it clear. This wasn't a mistake, it was a pattern, a culture, a system designed to protect power and punish truth. And if it hadn't been for the footage, the leak, and the outrage, Jameson might have disappeared into the system like so many before him, unheard, unseen, broken. But instead, his story became a turning point, and as the trial began, as Brenner sat stone-faced in a courtroom filled with supporters and protesters, as Jameson took the stand and looked his attacker in the eye, the world held its breath, watching, remembering, and hoping that this time, justice might finally be served. The courtroom was packed to the walls with a mixed sea of reporters, activists, local residents, and law enforcement, some in uniform, some in plain clothes. Their eyes locked on Jameson Wright as he sat just feet away from the man who had shattered his window, crushed his face, and nearly erased his future. And the air was thick with tension as prosecutor Yvette Sims rose to deliver her opening statement, her voice calm but razor-sharp as she laid out the facts in a methodical cadence, showing the jury's still frames from the Bodycam footage, pausing at the exact moment the flashlight made contact with the glass, when Officer Brenner's arm shot through the window like a weapon. And then the moment Jameson's head snapped back under the force of the punch, the courtroom, gasping audibly as Sims stated clearly, this was not fear. This was not protocol. This was rage. This was brutality. And on the defense side, Brenner's attorney Mark Greer squirmed in his seat, well aware that the video was damning but determined to twist the narrative, to lean into the shadowy space of officer perception and split-second decision-making that so often led to acquittals. But the prosecution had more than footage. They had witnesses, whistleblowers, victims, and most importantly, they had a story that resonated far beyond the courtroom, a story of a man whose only crime was being black and behind the wheel. And as Jameson stood and walked to the witness stand, his hands trembled slightly but his voice didn't crack. He told the jury how he'd driven the same route every week for 3 years without incident, how he'd slowed at the blinking red light and rolled forward cautiously, how the lights flashed behind him and he'd felt a familiar chill of anxiety, not panic, just the resigned nervousness of a man who'd grown up learning that the wrong tone, the wrong move, or the wrong look could get you killed, how he'd placed his license on the dashboard before the officer even approached, how he kept both hands on the wheel and looked straight ahead, how he said, "Good evening, officer," and received no response before Brenner barked, "Open the door." Without explanation, how he tried to comply but was frozen by the ferocity in the officer's eyes, and how, before he could even blink, the glass exploded and his world went black, and he remembered pain, pressure, confusion, screaming voices, the hot pavement burning his cheek, and the officer's knee crushing his back as he gasped, "I can't breathe," over and over until everything went silent, and when he woke up, he was in a cell, his hands cuffed, his lips swollen, his memory fractured and his life forever altered, and as he described how his daughter cried when she saw him with stitches across his face, how his job suspended him pending investigation, how neighbors treated him like a criminal because the official police statement claimed he had attacked an officer during a routine stop. The jury sat motionless, not a single eye blinking, not a single person unmoved, and when Prosecutor Sims asked him, "Jameson, what would justice look like for you?" he paused, looked straight ahead and said, "Justice would be never having to explain to my son why I was beaten for trying to come home." And the silence that followed was heavy, thick, suffocating, broken only by the click of the next slide on the prosecution's monitor, this time an internal email dated just hours after the incident, in which Officer Brenner wrote to his sergeant, "Got a little rough tonight. We might need to scrub the footage. Don't want this one going public." And the courtroom erupted in murmurs as the judge banged his gavel for order, and in the coming days, witness after witness took the stand. Not just fellow officers but civilians, former detainees, and even a retired police clerk who admitted to being told to delete complaints that weren't officially filed, painting a portrait of a department more focused on public image than public safety. And as the narrative unfolded, so did the cracks in Brenner's own story, his claim that Jameson lunged toward the gearshift contradicted by the footage, his sworn testimony that verbal commands were ignored, shattered by the clearly audible recording of Jameson asking, "What's going on?" before being attacked, and then came the forensic analysts, who confirmed there were no fingerprints, no DNA, no sign that Jameson ever touched anything under his seat or reached for anything at all, and then came Officer Leticia Ramos, who took the stand in full uniform, her voice firm despite the tension, as she described a years-long pattern of excessive force incidents that went uninvestigated, a culture of silence where you either looked the other way or became a target, and when she was asked why she chose to speak now, she looked directly at Jameson and said, "Because I watched that footage and knew it could have been my brother, my father, my son." And her words hit like a hammer, stirring tears in half the jury, and leading the judge to call a brief recess, during which protesters outside the courthouse chanted Jameson's name and held signs with the words, "The Bodycam never lies," while inside Brenner sat frozen, his once confident posture deflating with every new piece of evidence, his attorney growing more desperate by the hour. And as the trial continued, a digital forensics expert revealed that an attempt had been made to overwrite the original Bodycam footage file. A failed attempt thanks to the cloud backup system installed by the city a year earlier after a previous scandal, and that revelation sealed the coffin, proving not just misconduct but attempted cover-up. And while the defense scrambled to argue that Brenner was misled by bad training or exhausted from overwork, it was clear to all that the actions were deliberate, calculated, and vicious, and when the jury finally retired to deliberate, they returned in less than 3 hours, their faces solemn as the foreman read aloud the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant Kyle Brenner guilty on all counts," and gasps and cries filled the courtroom, with Jameson holding his head in his hands, silent tears streaming down his cheeks as his wife gripped his shoulder, and the judge, in a rare moment of candor, stated, "This court acknowledges the courage it took for Mr. Wright to seek justice, and the systemic failures that allowed this incident to occur." Before sentencing Brenner to 18 years without parole for aggravated assault under color of authority, attempted destruction of evidence and false reporting, and even as the gavel struck and the crowd erupted in applause, the story didn't end there. Because what had started with shattered glass now spread like wildfire across the state, prompting investigations into 5 other precincts, leading to 14 resignations, 3 additional indictments, and the creation of an independent civilian oversight board with subpoena power and transparency mandates, and Jameson, now an unwilling but powerful voice in police reform, used his platform to push for national legislation requiring immediate public release of Bodycam footage. And as he spoke at universities, town halls, and even on Capitol Hill, he always ended with the same sentence: I didn't ask to be the face of this, but now that I am, I won't let the next person go through what I did. And his story, once buried beneath glass and asphalt, became a beacon, a battle cry, a demand for a better future, and the image of his broken face on the night of the attack was replaced by a new photo. Jameson standing tall, holding his daughter's hand, smiling in front of the courthouse where justice had finally arrived. Not just for him, but for everyone who watched, everyone who believed, and everyone who said, "This ends now." So if you're watching this and you believe in truth, in justice, and accountability, don't look away, don't scroll past, don't stay silent, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story, because the world only changes when we force it to, and the Bodycam revealed more than brutality. It revealed a system that counted on your silence. And Jameson Wright proved it doesn't have to win. Absolutely, and as the story spread beyond Rosefield, beyond Florida, beyond even the borders of the United States, it became more than just a local news piece. It became a national reckoning, sparking town halls, congressional hearings, and a wave of protests that mirrored those of previous years, but carried with them a renewed sense of urgency, because this time there was undeniable proof, raw, unedited bodycam footage, and a paper trail of deliberate deceit and cover-up, and more victims began to come forward, not just in Rosefield but across counties and states. One by one they emerged with stories that bore haunting similarities: stopped for minor infractions windows, smashed knees on necks, false charges. And when reporters dug deeper, they found that Officer Brenner had once trained at a facility known for its aggressive tactical approach to civilian interactions, an institution that preached compliance through intimidation, not communication. And Brenner was not alone. Over 24 officers in Rosefield had completed that same training, and of those more than half had excessive force complaints pending, but never acted upon, because the internal affairs process was historically weaponized against complainants, often burying paperwork, never returning calls, or dismissing investigations for lack of evidence. But now everything was coming out: every buried complaint, every suppressed report, every coerced statement. And it wasn't just law enforcement under scrutiny. Local judges who had signed off on arrest warrants without review were being questioned. Prosecutors who failed to investigate police misconduct were facing ethics committees, and the police union that once blindly shielded its members was now facing internal revolt from younger officers demanding change. And amidst this storm, Jameson Wright remained grounded, determined not to let the media spectacle eclipse the human cost. He held private counseling sessions for victims, he testified at multiple state legislative hearings, and when offered a major book deal he declined, instead partnering with local universities to create training programs for law enforcement that emphasized de-escalation, bias recognition, and trauma-informed policing. And though he still bore the scars from that night, both visible and invisible, he refused to be seen as broken. He often said healing is resistance, and so he healed not just for himself, but for everyone watching, and his impact reached high school curriculums where social studies teachers began using his case to teach civics and ethics. His name became synonymous with accountability, not victimhood, and yet he never stopped reminding people this wasn't about him, it was about a system, and systems require structural change, not just apologies or isolated convictions. And so in the third year following the incident, a federal investigation was launched into systemic misconduct in Rosefield and several surrounding departments. A task force uncovered years of racial profiling, illegal stops, evidence planting, and even surveillance of community organizers. And at the center of it all was a network of senior officers, including 2 retired chiefs, who had orchestrated cover-ups using coded language and backchannels. One of the whistleblowers, an IT contractor, revealed that internal data systems had been programmed to automatically delete complaints after 90 days, unless a supervisor manually flagged them, which rarely happened. And this revelation sent shockwaves through the legal world, prompting appeals and retrials of dozens of convictions based on falsified arrest records, and the city of Rosefield found itself paying out over $50 million in settlements, while its insurance provider dropped its coverage, citing unprecedented liability and public trust, which had been eroding for decades, finally hit bottom when a civilian review board released a full audit report detailing how tax dollars had been funneled into overtime, fraud, weapons purchases, and private training retreats for officers, with records of Absolutely, and in the final stretch of this journey, the world had already taken note. Policies were rewritten, officers retrained, and citizens reawakened to the power they held in their hands through cameras, through voices, through the simple act of watching, not turning away. And it was here in this final chapter that Jameson began writing his own legacy, not through speeches or televised interviews, but through action. He co-founded an initiative called From Shattered Glass to Solid Ground, a program that paired survivors of police brutality with mental health support, legal aid, and advocacy training, empowering victims to not just recover but rebuild and rise. And through this program, dozens of men and women came forward, finding healing in their shared pain and strength in each other's testimony. And even as some critics tried to claim that reform had gone too far, or that officers now hesitated too much on duty, the data said otherwise. Complaints dropped, public trust rose, and crime rates held steady, disproving the myth that justice and safety couldn't coexist. And while some former officers from the old Rosefield force filed lawsuits claiming wrongful termination, none succeeded, the courts citing the overwhelming evidence of their complicity or negligence. And those who had truly served with integrity were welcomed into the new system, provided they retrained under the community-first philosophy. And at every graduation of new officers, Jameson was invited to speak, though he often declined, preferring to sit quietly in the back rows, watching young faces take oaths with clear eyes and steady hands, knowing they were stepping into a world his suffering had helped to change. And on the day his daughter graduated high school, he gave her a necklace with a pendant made from one of the glass shards that had been pulled from his face, a symbol. He told her of survival, of transformation, of taking pain and turning it into purpose, and she wore it proudly, saying she would study law not to get revenge but to make the system better. And as the years passed, the story of the smashed window became legend, told in law schools, referenced in policy papers, reenacted in documentaries, but never forgotten. And in moments of national crisis, when new videos of injustice emerged and fresh wounds opened, Jameson's story was shared anew. Not because it was the worst, not because it was unique, but because it ended with something rare. In such stories, justice and hope, and that hope inspired legislation named after him, the Right Act, which mandated the federal release of bodycam footage within 72 hours of incidents involving force, prohibited the deletion of public complaints, and created a national registry for officers with misconduct records, making it harder for bad cops to simply relocate and start fresh. And though the bill faced resistance, it passed with bipartisan support thanks to pressure from the public and persistent lobbying by survivors turned activists. And in the years that followed, the ripple effects of that law touched every state and agency, demanding accountability, not as a punishment, but as a foundation for rebuilding trust. And while Jameson never called himself a hero, those around him did. Children who once feared the police now dreamed of becoming officers who protected, not punished. Elders who had marched in the 60s said they saw in him the continuation of their struggle, and young activists called him a blueprint, not for rage but for resistance. Through resilience, and even internationally, his story crossed borders, screened in human rights conferences and seminars on law enforcement reform, cited by scholars from Brazil to South Africa as proof that civilian-led accountability was not a fantasy, but a fact. And yet through it all, Jameson remained rooted, never forgetting the night that changed everything, never letting the weight of his influence inflate his ego. He still shopped at the same grocery store, walked his dog through the same park where he was once stopped for looking suspicious. And when he spoke at events, he always ended with the same words, "I am not the first, this story is not mine alone." And one day, as he stood at the unveiling of a national memorial dedicated to victims of state violence, he read the names etched into the granite, and wept, not for himself, but for those whose stories never went viral, whose footage was lost, whose cries were ignored. And he placed a single rose at the base of the monument, whispering a promise to keep fighting, not with fists but with truth. And as the camera crew filming the event panned out, capturing the crowd, the tears, the quiet resolve, they knew they were documenting more than a ceremony. They were capturing a shift, a movement crystallized in the image of one man standing tall despite the scars, a reminder that justice, though delayed, can still be delivered. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows on the stone, his voice carried one final message: if you're Watching this, if you care enough to stay through every minute, every word, every truth, then you're part of the change. You are the witness, the amplifier, the protector of memory. So hit like, not for clicks, but for commitment. Subscribe not for entertainment, but for engagement, and share this story, because the system banks on you forgetting, and this is how we remember, this is how we win.